In 1845, a fungus arrived in Ireland. It spread silently. Field by field. County by county. It turned potato crops black overnight, rotting them in the ground before farmers could harvest them. Within a year, the primary food source for roughly 3 million Irish people had simply ceased to exist. What followed was one of the worst humanitarian disasters in European history. 1 million people dead. Another million fled the country in a single year. Ireland lost more than 20% of its entire population in less than a decade. And the plant at the center of all of it? A crop that Ireland had only been eating for about 200 years. A plant that Europeans had initially refused to touch. A vegetable that most of the Western world once considered poisonous, suspicious, and fit only for animals. The potato. Today you can buy a 5-pound bag at any grocery store for under $3. It sits on your kitchen counter, completely unremarkable. But the story behind that bag involves the collapse of empires, the feeding of armies, the explosive growth of human population, and one of the most catastrophic famines in recorded history. So how did a lumpy underground tuber from the mountains of South America become the most important crop in the modern world? The answer starts 11,000 feet above sea level in the Andes Mountains of South America, and it is stranger than almost anything you have been taught in school. In 1845, a fungus arrived in Ireland. It spread silently. Field by field. County by county. It turned potato crops black overnight, rotting them in the ground before farmers could harvest them. Within a year, the primary food source for roughly 3 million Irish people had simply ceased to exist. What followed was one of the worst humanitarian disasters in European history. 1 million people dead. Another million fled the country in a single year. Ireland lost more than 20% of its entire population in less than a decade. And the P. Around 8000 BC, in the high-altitude plateau region surrounding Lake Titicaca on the border of modern-day Peru and Bolivia, indigenous Andean communities began doing something that would quietly change the fate of the entire human race. They started domesticating wild potatoes. This was not simple work. Wild potatoes in their original form contain high levels of glycoalkaloids, compounds that are genuinely toxic to humans. They taste bitter, they cause nausea, and in sufficient quantities they can kill you. The plant had evolved these toxins as a defense mechanism against being eaten by insects and animals. The Andean farmers figured out over generations of careful selective cultivation which varieties were safe to eat, which grew best in the brutal high-altitude climate, and critically, how to remove the remaining toxins through a process called freeze-drying. Here is how it worked. Andean nights at high altitude are cold enough to freeze potatoes solid. Farmers would spread fresh potatoes on the ground overnight, allow them to freeze, then wake at dawn and physically stomp on them to squeeze out the moisture. This process was repeated over several days until the remaining water evaporated completely, leaving behind a dried, preserved food called chuno. Chuno could be stored for years, even decades, without spoiling. It was the ancient world's answer to a food security crisis in a climate where almost nothing else would grow reliably. It was extraordinarily nutritious, lightweight, and portable. The Inca Empire, which dominated western South America from roughly 1400 to 1532 CE, built much of its military and administrative power on this single innovation. Inca armies marched on chuno. Inca storehouses packed with freeze-dried potato-fed workers who built the mountain roads and stone cities that still astonish engineers today. The potato was not just food in the Andes. It was infrastructure. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, over 3,000 varieties of potato were being cultivated across the Andes. 3,000. The genetic diversity was extraordinary, built across millennia of careful agricultural selection by communities whose names most history books never mention. The Spanish brought potatoes back to Europe sometime around 1570. And Europe, almost unanimously, wanted nothing to do with them. The resistance was not entirely irrational. The potato belongs to the nightshade family, which includes several genuinely toxic plants. The green parts of a potato plant are in fact poisonous. European botanists who examined the plant in the 16th century noticed its resemblance to deadly nightshade, a plant associated with witchcraft and death, and they drew the obvious wrong conclusion. If you are finding this kind of buried history useful, subscribe now. New videos on the hidden forces that built the modern world drop every week. Beyond the toxicity fears, there was a theological objection that sounds absurd today but was completely sincere at the time. The Bible made no mention of potatoes. Wheat, barley, lentils, these were the foods of Scripture. The potato appeared nowhere in the holy text, which for many deeply religious Europeans in the 16th century was reason enough for suspicion. Some Protestant communities in Switzerland actually banned potato cultivation outright on these grounds. European peasants who were forced to try potatoes by landlords or administrators frequently reported that they caused leprosy, syphilis, and excessive sexual appetite. None of this was true. But when a new food arrives with no cultural context, no preparation tradition, and a genuine physical resemblance to plants that actually kill people, fear fills the gap. For nearly 200 years after its arrival in Europe, the potato was treated as a curiosity. Botanists grew it in botanical gardens as a novelty. The Spanish fed it to hospital patients and prison populations. A few isolated communities in Ireland and the Basque region of Spain began incorporating it into their diets in the early 1600s, largely because they had few alternatives. But mainstream European agriculture ignored it almost entirely. Then Frederick the Great of Prussia decided to weaponize it. Frederick the Great understood something that most of his contemporaries missed. An army that could only be fed with grain was an army that could be starved into submission. Grain stores could be located, seized, and burned. An underground crop was a different proposition entirely. You cannot burn a field of potatoes. You cannot find and destroy something buried 6 inches underground across thousands of acres of farmland. Frederick saw the potato not just as food but as military insurance. Starting in the 1740s, Frederick the Great of Prussia began a systematic campaign to force potato cultivation on his reluctant population. He issued royal edicts mandating potato growing. He sent soldiers to distribute potato seedlings to farmers. When Prussian peasants refused or dragged their feet, his administration threatened punishment. The most famous story from this campaign may or may not be entirely true, but it captures the logic perfectly. Frederick allegedly planted a royal potato field, surrounded it with guards, and made it appear that the crop was being protected as a royal treasure. Curious peasants, reasoning that anything the king guarded that carefully must be worth having, began sneaking in to steal potato plants for themselves. Frederick, according to the story, quietly instructed his guards to look the other way at night. Whether or not the story is precisely accurate, the strategy behind it was real. Frederick understood that perceived scarcity creates desire. And it worked. Potato cultivation spread across Prussia. Other European monarchs watched the results, particularly the military implications, and followed suit. Marie Antoinette, not generally remembered as an agricultural reformer, famously wore potato flowers in her hair at court to popularize the plant among French nobility. Her husband Louis XVI issued similar planting mandates. The philosopher Denis Diderot, who helped compile the French Enlightenment's great encyclopedia of human knowledge, wrote that the potato had been unfairly maligned and could potentially solve European hunger. By the late 1700s, a crop that had been dismissed as poisonous fodder for a century and a half was being championed by Prussian kings, French queens, and Enlightenment philosophers simultaneously. And the results were almost immediate, and almost unimaginable in scale. Here is the number that should stop you cold. In 1700, the population of Europe was approximately 100 million people. By 1900, it was 400 million. A fourfold increase in 2 centuries. Nothing in human history before that point had come close to that rate of population growth. Historians, economists, and agricultural scientists have studied this explosion for generations trying to understand what caused it. The potato is the single biggest answer. A single acre of potato cultivation produces roughly 3 to 4 times more calories than the same acre planted with grain. Potatoes grow in soils too poor for wheat or barley. They grow in climates too wet, too cold, and too short season for most staple crops. They require significantly less labor to plant and harvest than grain. And they are nutritionally dense in a way that grain simply is not, containing substantial vitamin C, potassium, and protein alongside their carbohydrate content. When subsistence farming families across Europe switched from grain-based agriculture to potato-based agriculture, they could suddenly feed more people on the same land with less work. Children who had grown up malnourished survived into adulthood. Adults who had lived on the edge of caloric insufficiency for generations suddenly had enough to eat. The populations of Ireland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Prussia, and large parts of Russia grew explosively through the 18th and 19th centuries in direct correlation with the geographic spread of potato cultivation. Economic historians Nunn and Xian published a landmark study in 2011 calculating that the introduction of the potato to the Old World explains approximately 1/4 of the entire population growth in Europe and Africa between 1700 and 1900. 1/4 of one of the most significant demographic events in human history, attributable to a single crop. The cities of the Industrial Revolution were fed by the potato. The factory workers of Manchester, Birmingham, and Brussels who built the modern industrial economy ate potatoes. The soldiers who fought the Napoleonic Wars across Europe were sustained by potato stores. The expansion of European civilization in the 18th and 19th centuries, for better and dramatically for worse, was fueled by a crop that Europeans had spent 200 years refusing to plant. Which brings us back to Ireland, and to 1845, and to the fungus. Ireland's adoption of the potato had been more extreme than almost anywhere else in Europe. By the early 19th century, the Irish peasant diet had become almost entirely potato-dependent. Not as a matter of choice, exactly. Ireland under British colonial rule had been systematically stripped of most of its productive agricultural land. The best land produced grain and cattle that were exported to Britain. What was left, the wet, rocky, marginal land in the west and south, was the land where poor Irish tenant farmers lived. And on that marginal land, the potato was not a crop among others. It was the only crop that produced enough calories to survive on. A single Irish adult in the early 1800s was estimated to consume 10 pounds of potatoes per day. Not because the Irish had some peculiar love of potatoes, but because 10 pounds of potatoes was what survival required when you had nothing else. The variety they depended on almost universally was called the lumper. Fast-growing, high-yielding, perfectly suited to Irish conditions. And genetically nearly identical across the entire country. That last detail is what made the disaster possible. Phytophthora infestans, the water mold now known as potato blight, arrived in Europe from North America in 1844. It spread to Ireland in 1845. And because virtually every potato in Ireland came from the same genetic stock, the blight swept through with nothing to stop it. There was no resistant variety to fall back on. There was no backup crop to substitute. There was nothing. The British government's response to the resulting famine was a study in ideological cruelty. Committed to free market economic principles, the administration of Prime Minister John Russell largely refused to intervene in food markets, continued allowing grain exports from Ireland to Britain even as 1 million people starved, and organized relief schemes so inadequate that they became a dark joke among the dying. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland lost approximately 25% of its population. 1 million dead. 2 million emigrated. Many of those emigrants went to the United States, permanently reshaping American urban culture, politics, and identity. The Irish-American community that would eventually produce presidents, police chiefs, senators, and cultural institutions across American history was seated in the catastrophic failure of a single potato crop. Today the global potato harvest exceeds 374 million metric tons annually. It is the fourth largest food crop on Earth after sugarcane, maize, and wheat. China is now the world's largest potato producer. India is second. The crop has traveled its full circle from the Andes to Europe to Asia, feeding populations the Inca farmers of Lake Titicaca could never have imagined. The genetic diversity that the Andes still holds, those thousands of potato varieties developed over 8,000 years of careful cultivation, has become a critical resource for modern agriculture. The International Potato Center in Lima, Peru maintains a gene bank of over 4,000 potato varieties, specifically to provide the genetic diversity that monoculture industrial agriculture has systematically destroyed in the crops it cultivates. The lesson of the Irish famine has not fully been learned. Modern industrial potato agriculture still relies on a handful of dominant varieties. The same vulnerability that made the lumper catastrophic in 1845 exists in modified form in potato fields across Europe and North America today. Walk into any kitchen in the world right now and the chances are good that something made from a potato is either on the counter, in the pantry, or in the refrigerator. French fries, chips, vodka, gnocchi, bread, stew. The potato is so embedded in global cuisine that its absence has become nearly unimaginable. But absence is exactly what 11,000 years of agricultural history has repeatedly taught us is possible. The Andean farmers who domesticated the wild potato over thousands of cold nights at altitude understood something about food security, genetic diversity, and the fragility of monoculture that the industrial world is still struggling to fully grasp. The crop that changed history forever is still changing it. It is in your kitchen right now. It fed the factories that built the modern world. It carried 1 million refugees across the Atlantic. It built empires. And it buried them. And it started with farmers in the mountains of South America, stomping on frozen tubers at dawn, 11,000 years before anyone in Europe had ever heard of it. If this story surprised you, subscribe and leave a comment with the potato fact that hit hardest. Because history is almost always stranger than what they taught you in school.